Okay, today we are going to finish our look at World War I by discussing the final reading of the textbook, which would be 29.4, which looks like this, A Flawed Peace. Right, so today's topic of conversation is going to be the Treaty of Versailles. This is the peace treaty that will end World War I, and generally speaking, most historians look at this very negatively. They see the treaty as not solving any of the problems that had caused the war to break out, and actually they say it will create resentment that will build up and lead to the Second World War less than 20 years after the treaty is created. So generally looked at as a failure. So let's talk about this failed peace conference. So after the fighting of World War I ends on November 11th, 1918, all the nations of the world, well, 32, gather in Paris to discuss the peace. Now, the major participants are going to be four main countries, the four winners of the war: the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. However, just as important as who the participants are, who is excluded is going to be a significant feature. Germany is not allowed to negotiate this peace treaty. It will be dictated to them. They are excluded completely. And Russia, because they had undergone a communist revolution, and no one likes communists, and because Russia had dropped out of the war and left the Allies high and dry, they are excluded as well. And so basically what we are doing here is we are going to try to create a lasting peace, but we're excluding two of the five most powerful nations inside of Europe. And so this is going to present some problems and some difficulties. All right, now, there are two conflicting ideas amongst the big four that is going to result in the Treaty of Versailles being this sort of compromise that makes nobody happy. And representing one side is the sort of idealistic side, the side that hopes to create a lasting peace, and that is going to be the United States, led by this man, Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson's going to have many ideas. He has two big ideas. Number one, he wants to create a Europe that is based on the idea of self-determination. If you remember back to the beginning of World War I, the main reason why it started is because a Serbian who felt that it was unfair that Austria-Hungary had land that Serbians lived in assassinated the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so what Wilson wants to do basically is break up these large empires and create smaller nations based on national identity. He will call this self-determination. And then the second idea he has that he thinks will ensure a lasting peace is represented here in this political cartoon. So Woodrow Wilson's big idea is the League of Nations. The League of Nations is an international organization where nations of the world can meet and talk and have the ability to interact with one another. And if the need should arise, address issues that threaten world peace. It's sort of what the United Nations is today. So this is Wilson's big idea. And you can see in this political cartoon that, whomever made this cartoon is a big supporter of the idea of the League of Nations. The dove is a universal sign of peace, and Wilson is taking the olive branch, which represents, extending peaceful sorts of things. And so lots of people are very hopeful that this League of Nations will prevent future war and things like that. So Wilson's plan is called the 14 points. And the two big idea of the 14 points, like I said, create a world based on self-determination, giving people a say as to what their nations actually look like and what their government is like, and League of Nations, international cooperation, right? So he represents the idealistic side of the League of Nations, but not everyone is feeling so optimistic and idealistic. The two main European powers at the conference, Britain and especially France, they don't really care about idealism. What they want to do is punish Germany and prevent it from ever hurting them again. And so this political cartoon represents the French view of what the Treaty of Versailles should do, which is punish the French. And so here we have Germany being held by the Allies and being forced to swallow the peace terms, which obviously is a very big pill, a tough pill to swallow, if you will. And so part of the League of Nations is going to represent idealism and Wilson's views of a lasting peace, but it's also going to impose really harsh restrictions on the Germans that Germany will have no say in negotiating and will basically be told, you have to accept these terms. And so it is going to engender a lot of animosity amongst the Germans, as we shall see. So let's talk about what the actual Treaty of Versailles creates. All right, so the first thing it does do is it does create the League of Nations. The League of Nations will be this international organization. We will talk about it in the run-up to World War II. I don't want to spoil things, but basically it's not going to work out. I am going to spoil one thing here. The United States proposes the idea of a League of Nations, but never actually joins the organization. We'll talk about why in a little bit. More importantly, let's talk about the punishments that Germany is going to receive from the Treaty of Versailles. Number one, Germany is going to be forced to do something that they feel is very unfair. And by doing this, it's going to justify all the other lousy things that the Allies are going to do to them, and it's represented right here on this slide. Germany is going to have to take all the blame for the war, right? They are going to insert a clause into the Treaty of Versailles. It is Article 231, and it reads as thus. The Allied and associate governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associate governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. Essentially, boiling that all down, Germany has to take the blame for the war. Now, those of you who are intuitive out there know what's coming next. Since Germany is responsible for the war, they've got to pay for it. And the second thing the Treaty of Versailles is going to do that is going to punish Germany is impose a huge war reparation on Germany. It's an undisclosed figure at first, but eventually that figure will be $336 billion that Germany is expected to pay for the war costs that Britain and France suffered during the war. Basically, Britain and France's stance here is that Germany's going to pay for our war debt. And it's going to cripple the German economy and cause major problems later on. But the punishment does not end just there. In addition to the war guilt clause and the war reparation fines, Germany is also going to face military restrictions. They will not be able to have an army over 100,000 men. They will be prohibited from developing submarines or U-boats that they had used so effectively during the war, and they are banned from having an air force. So basically, this is France's doing. They want to severely curtail Germany's war-making abilities. In addition to that, Germany will also lose land. Parts of Germany will be given to France to extend France's border and make them more defensible. The eastern parts of Germany will be taken away from Germany and turned into new countries. We'll look at a map here in a second and see what I'm talking about there. And all German colonies in Asia, in Africa, are taken away from them and divided up between the British and the French, who will now call them mandates. Now, mandates sound like it's something new, but basically it just means colony. We'll talk about mandates more in a second as well. Now, the other nations that had fought with Germany are going to sign peace treaties that basically do the same thing to them. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were the two other major powers in the Central Powers, and they will see huge swaths of territory taken away from them. So let's take a look at a map and see how the map of Europe and Asia changes because of World War I. All right, so the map on the left before World War I shows you what Europe looks like, and then the map on the right shows you what happens afterwards, and that's the more important map. We'll move my face over here. So as you can see, Germany is going to lose territory both on its western border, let's see if I can get my cursor here, right, to France, as well as its eastern border, right? Poland and Czechoslovakia are going to take territory out of Germany and incorporate them into these new nation states. Look at all these new nations that exist in Central and Eastern Europe: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia. These are all nations created by the Treaty of Versailles, this idea of self-determination that Wilson had been talking about. Now, of course, there's a problem with this. There are going to be German-speaking people that live within Poland and Czechoslovakia, And that is going to be a source of frustration for many German-speaking people moving forward. We'll talk more about that when we get into the run-up for World War II. So Austria-Hungary is basically wiped off the map. 5 new nations are created out of territory for that, and Germany is significantly smaller than it was before the war began. Now, they're not the only ones that lost territory. Here is a map of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had extended across North Africa into Southwest Asia, but what we are going to see is that the Republic of Turkey is all that remains of the Ottoman Empire. For those who don't remember, the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire made up of Turkish-speaking people. And so the nation of Turkey, not named after the bird, named after the Turkish people that live there. That's the only piece of territory that remains independent from Allied control. The rest of the territories that the Ottoman Empire had controlled, most importantly, the Arab peoples of what today we call the Middle East, will be divided up into mandates, really just colonies, between the British and the French. And so what this means is that the modern day Middle East and the nations that exist there were created by British and French diplomats at the Treaty of Versailles, essentially. So British takes control of Palestine, which will eventually become the state of Israel. That's a huge problem area in the world. Syria, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Kuwait, all these nations are going to come into existence. Their borders will be created by these European diplomats. And this has been a very tense area and a source of constant conflict in the 20th century. All right, so those are the main features of the war. Now let's talk about how people feel about it after it is created. So basically, this is a big compromise that leaves absolutely nobody happy. Germany is going to be very upset. They are going to feel great animosity that they have to take all the blame and pay huge amounts of money in fines. They're going to be very angry that they have military restrictions and loss of territory. And so many Germans will feel embittered. It's important to remember that the governments during these wars censored news. And so most Germans thought that they were winning the war. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere in 1918, they announce a ceasefire. And then all of a sudden, this peace is imposed upon them that is really punitive. And many of the Germans they can't reconcile how that happened. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on next week as well, maybe 2 weeks. All right, the United States. The United States had played a big role in the shaping of the Treaty of Versailles with President Woodrow Wilson, but after the war is over, we are going to see the United States is going to kind of return to what its attitude was like at the beginning of the war, which is basically the United States doesn't want to be involved in European affairs. We had never really been. World War I is this blip where we get involved, and after it's over, we're kind of like, maybe we shouldn't be involved in these affairs. Maybe they're just going to drag us into their conflicts. Now, this is not something that all Americans believe. You can see here with these political cartoons that some think this is a good idea and some think it's a bad idea. This political cartoon over here on the left is talking about the United States refusing to join the League of Nations. And obviously, the author who made this political cartoon feels that is justified, that they're not going to be involved in the League of Nations, even though it was Wilson's own idea. This represents isolationism. The U.S. should separate themselves from the rest of the world, let the world worry about themselves, we'll just take care of us. Now, Dr. Seuss, yes, that Dr. Seuss, made a political cartoon. He was opposed to isolationism in the United States. And here you see problems in the 1930s in Europe, and the United States is not getting involved whatsoever. And he thinks that this is foolish, right? It says, what a lucky thing we've got separate beds. But at the bottom here, it says, ho hum, no chance of contagion. He is being sarcastic. He feels that the United States should get involved and stop these problems that are festering in Europe. But no one really supports that. And so basically, when the war is over, the United States never signs the Treaty of Versailles, never joins the League of Nations, even though it's our idea. And this political cartoon really summarizes how the U.S. feels about international politics. Basically, that the United States is not going to get involved in international affairs, that the European actions that had dragged us into war one time aren't going to drag us into war another time, And this is going to be the dominant train of thought in the United States. This, my name is Paul, this stuff's between y'all, up until 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The United States will not be involved in the first 2 years of fighting when World War II breaks out in Europe. Okay. France is upset about the Treaty of Versailles because they feel it doesn't punish Germany enough. If you want to know more about that, you should take AP Europe. We talk about that quite in depth. Japan and Italy had joined the side of the Allies looking to gain territories. They are going to be upset because they didn't get as much territory as they wanted. And then the colonial peoples of Africa and Asia are going to be very upset. Basically, the Europeans, well, really, Wilson, is going to talk about the idea of self-determination, that people should live in societies where they have a say in what it is, but that's only going to be extended to Europeans. They aren't going to allow for African and Asian independence. They're going to remain as subjugated colonies, and basically, this is going to make them feel upset about it. And so we're going to see the beginnings of decolonization movements. Gandhi and the Indian National Congress Party in India will begin to ramp up their nonviolent protests against British rule, and other organizations in many different colonies will begin to really pick up steam and gain support. All right, so when the Treaty of Versailles is announced in 1919, nobody is happy, and this is best exemplified by the last political cartoon that I'll show you today. Out of the Treaty of Versailles crawls the Nazi Party, as you can see in this political cartoon. Basically, Adolf Hitler was a veteran of World War I, and he is going to capitalize on the resentment that the Versailles Treaty causes inside of German people to start a political party that will be known as the National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, and he will rail against the Treaty of Versailles and the embarrassment that it causes Germany, and he will start to gain electoral success. It will take a while. It won't really resonate with people until after the Great Depression starts in 1929, but many of the things that Hitler says to gain a following deals directly with bad-mouthing and calling for policies that resist what the Treaty of Versailles imposed upon Germany. All right, that's it for World War I. Next week, we'll have 3 videos that you guys can look at. I am going to do two videos on the Russian Revolution. So we're going to look at 30.1 and then 30.2. And then next Friday, we're going to look at art that is produced in the early 20th century. There is no textbook reading that goes along with it. It's just a little supplemental. Well, this is supplemental, so it's supplemental to the supplemental information for you to look at. We'll look at some surrealist and Dada art. We'll also look at Soviet propaganda that is produced, Soviet realism. So we'll look at those things next week. That's all for this week. There is a lecture or notes that will be posted along with this. Obviously, if you found this video, you can see the notes. So until we talk on Monday, I'm out.